Hello, and a very warm welcome to you to this Women in COG in Conversation with Emma Thomson today. So my name is Sharon Peacock. I'm Professor of Public Health and Microbiology at the University of Cambridge and also a Director of the COVID-19 Genomics UK Consortium. And I'm delighted today to welcome our chair for this session, Angela Beckett, and our speaker, Emma Thomson. So just to tell you a little bit about Emma, so Professor Thomson, OBE, is from the University of Glasgow and Professor in Infectious Diseases at the MRC-University of Glasgow Centre for Virus Research. She's also a COG-UK Principal Investigator. So she was recently awarded the OBE, or Officer of the Most Excellent Order of the British Empire, for her services to the NHS during the COVID-19 response. Currently, Professor Thomson is really heavily involved in sequencing the SARS-CoV-2 virus as part of COG-UK, and she's the local principal investigator for 2 vaccine trials running within Greater Glasgow and Clyde. So in addition to her work with COVID-19, Professor Thomson's main research focus is on emerging infections in Uganda, where she's working very closely with the Uganda Virus Research Institute and in the UK. So Angela Beckett is a specialist research technician at the University of Portsmouth with a background in infectious disease and high containment. So after completing an MSc in medical microbiology, she went on to work at Porton Down, where she was responsible for developing viral diagnostic assays and specialized vaccines. Initially hired to perform research on novel PET-A's discovery, I think that Angela, you'll be able to tell us more about that, but I think that's an enzyme. Her first day on the job, actually in Portsmouth, was the first day of lockdown. Since then, she's been working at the local NHS site in Portsmouth, where she's helped to establish and maintain the University of Portsmouth COG-UK sequencing site. And so I'm really looking forward to our session today. It's going to be running with a conversation between Emma and Angie right the way through till 12:50. And then there'll be 10 minutes for you, the audience, to actually give us your questions. Now, to do that, you'll need to use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. You won't be able to put up your hand and ask them yourselves, but if you write your questions in the chat box, then we'll be able to ask them on your behalf. And then we're going to close at 1 o'clock. In terms of Zoom etiquette, it's the usual rules. If you would keep your video off and your sound off during the conversation, but do feel free to turn on your video in the Q&A should you wish to do so. So thank you so much, and I'm going to hand over now to Angie for the main event in discussion with Emma. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Yes, so Emma, the first question really is about your early career. So you went to a comprehensive school and then studied medicine at the University of Glasgow. You did your PhD at Imperial College London, and then you worked as a clinical fellow at the University of Oxford. What were the particular hurdles that you had to overcome on your way to becoming a professor?
Well, I'm still quite surprised that they let me become a professor. So that probably suggests that many of the hurdles that we face are internal. And I actually had a really excellent urban comprehensive education in Glasgow and some really great teachers that inspired me. I think perhaps the one thing that what has become more apparent to me recently is that a whole part of the Glasgow community was perhaps missing from that school, and that those children of professors and doctors were probably mostly at private schools, and so the normalization and sort of expectations of what was possible were not always apparent to me, and that also was the time of maybe the slightly grey Thatcher years, certainly in Glasgow, when there were teacher strikes. And so I think quite a lot of parents probably put their children into private schools at that time that might not have otherwise done it. And I think the thing that I'm sort of most aware of as a result of that is that I think that the levels of kind of confidence and articulate expression that you see in people who went to private schools, I'd like that to be instilled in children at state schools. I think that's really important, and I think it's something that should probably be addressed. I think the level of education is great, but this sort of self-expression and public speaking and so on is definitely a feature probably for people who went to comprehensive schools, and that's something that I've worked on quite a bit. I've had training in it, and I actually quite like Zoom for that reason. I find Zoom easier almost than public events, and I think it's probably quite important to be aware of these barriers, which are all self-imposed to a large extent, and work on covering those bases. I guess the other thing is, though, that I'm lucky to work with a really good team of people, and you don't have to be good at everything, and there are other people that can cover those bases, and there are also definitely lots of good scientists who don't like public speaking, for example.
Absolutely, yes. You seem to have like a lot of self-awareness about your strengths and the things you feel like you might need to work on, and I guess that must really help then you kind of plan where you need to put your effort in to grow, like your communication style, for example. I guess I was wondering, like, what inspired you to pursue a career in science in the first place? Because you have kind of an unusual career trajectory in that you did medicine first and then kind of moved to science afterwards.
Well, I did medicine first, almost certainly because that was the route that you take if you get good grades. And actually, I should say that those grades weren't even, I didn't expect them. And even my physics teacher phoned the exam board to check that this was actually correct, that I got an A in physics, because I guess it just took me a bit longer to get around to reading the book and appreciating the sort of importance of passing those exams. And then I was slightly taken by surprise, and obviously it wasn't just me. I think it was the teachers as well that I passed it. But and so I think medicine was just that route for someone who was interested in science at that time. That was probably not thought through as well as it might have been, because I was actually really interested in how things work, and I wanted to understand things perhaps a bit more than wanting to be a doctor exactly, but I also thought it was a good way of putting learning about biology to good use, and so that's why I did it. But I actually also had a really strong interest in evolution, and it came from my grandfather, who he was Irish and a hydroelectric engineer in the Highlands of Scotland, and he was also involved in the Clyde Tunnel in Glasgow, which is a nice sort of standing legacy to him. But he gave me The Selfish Gene by Richard Dawkins at some point when I was quite young, and I really enjoyed it, and I read Darwin after that as well, and became quite obsessed with pigeons for a long time, and had all the different photos of different types of pigeons because of that chapter on variation under domestication. And I perhaps if I thought about it harder at the time, I might just have gone straight into science, actually.
Yeah, but I guess it's really important to have those role models, isn't it? And it's interesting how different influences can kind of change the shape of your career. But I'm sure all the background you have in medicine has also come in useful for your later career, right? You know, it's easy to look back and do the I shoulda, woulda, coulda, line, but there's a reason you're here today, and I'm sure all of those steps along the way have like had a huge contribution to that.
Yeah, I think medicine gives you an idea of the big picture, right? So you get this feeling of why you're interested in doing something. And the other thing it does is it gives you an immediate reward system, which so probably those of us who've done medicine enjoy that, the sort of technical part of figuring out what's wrong with patients and then seeing the result of that afterwards. Whereas scientists, I imagine like the scientists who've been involved in the mRNA technologies, for example, don't have that reward system, but they've probably had a much more important role really in saving millions of lives with new vaccines.
Absolutely. I guess moving on now from your kind of early career, I know that you've done a lot of research in Africa and Uganda, and I was wondering if this research you've done in emerging infections there has kind of helped prepare you for the work you ended up doing during the COVID pandemic we've just experienced?
Yeah, I was in Uganda, which is like, it's my favorite place in the world, I think, in 2020, early 2020, when the COVID pandemic was emerging in Europe, and we'd been working on emerging virus discovery in Uganda with the Uganda Virus Research Institute, and we've been particularly looking at causes of non-malarial fever in rural health centres on the border with the Democratic Republic of Congo, so quite rural parts of Uganda. And we had this plan to look at people who were getting fever that was not caused by malaria or other obvious infections, and then sequence them to see what viruses were there. And we also looked at the ecosystem within 5 kilometers of those health centres. And so we did collections of mosquitoes with an entomologist who works as a PhD fellow in my team, and also with a vet. And we sampled bats, rodents, other domestic animals, cattle, goats, and so on. And so we had we wanted to get a view of what was around the health centres where people were living, and then also what was getting into humans in these sentinel sites. And then it all stopped when COVID-19 happened, and we realized that we're going to have to come home. And in fact, we just got back to analysing that data now and writing those papers. And it turns out that we found more than 400 viruses in the mosquitoes and more than 50 in ticks, and a couple of new viruses that haven't been seen before in humans as well. So we're working on those samples now. So that was actually held up for 2 years.
Wow.
And we basically switched that off and switched into COVID-19. But it was obvious that the methods that we were using and that we really worked on setting up could be immediately used for SARS-CoV-2.
Amazing. And crazy that it's a shame, obviously, that our work's been delayed, but amazing that you're finding such diversity and all these results that are going to be so helpful to your work there. I guess as well, now that you've spent the last 2 years on COVID, are there some lessons learned from this pandemic that you can now take back to your work in Uganda?
Definitely. I mean, I think we've made our methods much more cost effective, for example, so we could probably do a lot more now than we could do at the time. And that really came from the funding that we got through COG-UK. And so we were able to really upscale and figure out ways in which we could be much more efficient. And also, we've been developing more innovative methods, which I think will be useful in Uganda as well. So one of the projects that we have is to work with people who are occupationally exposed to viruses of high consequence. So healthcare workers in particular, and we've been working also with abattoir workers in Uganda. And some of the methods that we're developing now, for example, the sort of metagenomic serology method, I think will be useful for looking at not just 1 or 2 viruses at a time in these occupationally exposed groups that we had been thinking we would look at, to actually looking at hundreds of viruses at the same time. And so, yeah, I'm quite excited about what we can do in Uganda now.
Definitely. Yeah, and I guess I know you talked in the past about how we have a global responsibility to work with other countries to protect themselves and us. And you talked, I guess, about this research and how that's addressing that responsibility. Do you have any advice on how others can contribute to addressing this, or how you came to be so passionate about this and how you made those kind of connections in the first place?
Well, I always had an interest in African politics because I come from quite a political family, and my mother used to she took me actually to sing when Nelson Mandela came to visit Glasgow. I remember we sang Nkosi Sikeleli, and I've always been kind of interested in politics and African politics since then. But it was really the link with Uganda actually came up because we were developing sequencing around about the same time, that perhaps a year ahead of what they were doing at the MRC Centre in UVRI, the Uganda Virus Research Institute. And so I was asked to go and be involved with the sequencing set up there by my director. And I said yes, but we have to have an interesting project to work on, or it's not going to be worthwhile. So that interesting project's just sort of grown and grown. And at the time I met 3 fellows who were interested in doing PhDs, and they all got funding, 2 through the MUI scheme and 1 through another scheme, to pursue their interest in emerging viral infections. And so I think once you build up those sorts of personal relationships, that lasts probably a lifetime rather than what felt like a very short commitment of a few months at the time has now, established relationships for years. And I hope that will continue. And I think there's a very good sort of background. There's now a very sort of a lot of expertise at UVRI in sequencing, and we can continue to feed each other with ideas and expertise as time goes on.
I guess you're kind of showing there that small things can quite easily snowball, and the importance of those relationships and collaborations with people that can really set up your entire career. So I guess not to take for granted those small things, because you never know where they're going to end up.
Yeah, I think every interaction matters, actually. You're right. I think you're right about that.
I'd be interested on your opinion, like as an expert in this field, about the booster doses that's been happening in the UK. So as it stands, around 60% of the total UK population have received a booster dose. Do you think that additional doses are going to be necessary?
I think additional doses of boosters are going to be necessary, particularly for vulnerable people. And we know that immunity wanes, and also we know that the most recent Omicron lineages are quite antigenically distant from what the lineage that the current vaccine was based on. It did really surprise me, actually, that boosting with that kind of almost ancient history type of design of vaccine still protects us, and I think that's extraordinary and good to know. But yes, I think it's very likely that we will have to adapt the vaccines in the coming years, and I think that particularly people who are vulnerable, older people and people with immunosuppression, are going to need adapted vaccines almost for sure.
Yeah, I guess that's something. Is that something that's in the pipeline at the moment? Do you know?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of trials. So the large mRNA companies are trialing Omicron variant vaccines, but of course Omicron is not one lineage anymore, and is changing quite rapidly as well. And so I think the really sort of positive thing is that mRNA technology is so adaptable, and you don't have to produce the protein any longer, which causes huge delays in manufacture. And so this mRNA technology is extraordinary, and I think it will mean that we can respond quite quickly with updated vaccines. I guess the difficulty is going to come around the way in which those are licensed, and if we can start using adapted vaccines in the same way that we do for flu, without having to trial every individual one at length before we use them. And I think that kind of regulatory situation, I assume, is being carefully considered now.
Yes, and with a lot of input from the government as well, I imagine, in terms of these booster rollouts. I know you yourself have quite a lot of interactions with policymakers, and you're a member of the Scottish Standing Committee on Pandemic Preparedness. So I'd kind of wonder, like, what does that role involve?
So my role in the Scottish Standing Committee for Pandemic Preparedness is an advisory role, and particularly with regard to vaccines and new technologies. And I do also have clinical experience, so sometimes I make clinical comments, but it's all about future pandemics. And so I think it's quite important that we don't just focus on COVID-19, because it's not the only route by which we might be hit by a pandemic. And of course, we've seen recently we've seen a rise in cases of pediatric hepatitis, for example, requiring children to have liver transplants across the world, and that probably has a viral trigger. And then also monkeypox seems to have found a new niche as well and spread globally. And so I think we do need to think about the ways in which viruses can enter the UK, and particularly that we need to think carefully about how I think we need to monitor very carefully returning travellers. I think there's a very real risk of imported infections becoming established in the UK very, very quickly, as of course we saw with COVID-19. And we wrote a paper on that, and there was another paper at the same time which showed same sort of numbers, similar numbers, that maybe SARS-CoV-2 came into the UK at least and got itself established at least 1,000 times. And that's reflects the changing world that we live in, and I think we need to think very carefully about how we are going to adapt to that. The thing that I find with policymakers is it's been fascinating working with them, and I think that all of, regardless of their political persuasion, I think the majority are very well meaning, and that we probably give them a bit of a hard time. I think in general they try to enact change for the better, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that. So the only problem with policymakers, I think, is that they're driven, probably also like us in science, by quite short-term goals and short-term funding opportunities.
Yeah.
And so I think we really do have to think carefully, like what you're doing with think about the planet and how we can adapt to a changing climate, and also to the amount of travel that we do around the world. And perhaps we have to change that, that we should reduce that. But if we're going to do it, we are going to see pandemics from viruses again and again. And then just in Glasgow, we've had CCHF, Ebola twice. We've had obviously COVID. We had avian influenza. We've had just about every virus that's emerged has arrived very quickly into that single urban centre. And so, obviously it's happening all the time, and probably sometimes we're missing it. And so I think there is a place for emerging technologies to detect those viruses and to make our diagnostic systems more robust.
Yeah, it doesn't take long for those things to travel, like you said, especially in the current climate. And you're right, I completely agree with what you said about this, like long-term planning can be so difficult, but I do believe that generally people do have the best interests of each other at heart. And yeah, taking this like positive outlook is definitely a good way to go about it. I guess when you're having to communicate with policymakers, they are in effect lay people. So is there a certain set of communication skills that you use in order to kind of influence and persuade policymakers?
Yeah, I think it's really important to try to distill the complexity of the situation into an understandable form. I don't think that we should be too reductive, and I'd really like to see a move away from this sort of black and white messaging, which I think puts people off scientists and policymakers, because inevitably if you take a black and white stance, you will be proven wrong sometimes. And I think I'd like to see more nuance brought into the public arena, and I think that's the area in which is most challenging as a communicator, to be able to say, I don't know, but this is probably how we should investigate further. And there are many tools that we can use to get to the truth. And I think we have a huge responsibility as scientists, particularly scientists funded by public money, to explain what we're using that for and what our way of thinking is, and more about the process of getting to the truth than black and white immediate messaging.
Yeah, I guess that kind of also applies to the public coverage that you have, because I know you've given a talk for the Glasgow Science Festival, you're featured on the BBC, The Guardian, BBC podcast, and of course all the COG-UK blog posts and things that we're talking about now. Are there different challenges to talking to the public, and what are the difficulties of taking such a complex and highly topical matter and like you said, kind of capturing that nuance still, but without this without kind of alienating people, getting them on board with what it is you're trying to convey?
Yeah, I think actually I think I've learned a lot from policymakers, because they tend to be very skilled at interacting with the public. And I think that personally the politicians that I like the most are the ones that are the most frank and give yes and no answers, and also seek to explain their thinking. And so I think that that's probably the way to go generally, with an honest, open approach. But you do have to display confidence perhaps as well about things that have a lot of evidence. So obviously vaccination is a big public theme, and the thing that concerns me and that we probably have to address really seriously is that there's an investment in misinformation, and there is money in misinformation, and so vaccine hesitancy to me seems completely normal and something that should be addressed in the public arena. It can be, events like this can help to communicate why you think strongly that vaccination is useful. But there are also forces which exist that are actually financial and have financial backing, and want to sell drugs which have no proven benefit, for example, to people who are vulnerable. And I think that has to be tackled, actually. And it's going to need an international approach, not a national one.
So you think that's going to tie back in with the policy again? So you think perhaps we need to have policies in place that protect?
I do. I think we need policies in place to protect against misinformation, and those need to be both national and international.
Yeah, because as it stands, it's kind of an unfair battle, right? Because the people who have the benefit of spreading misinformation can use whichever tactics they want to kind of compel people to follow them, and they have a financial benefit to gain from that, whereas the science community want to be balanced. They don't want to lie in order to convince people. So it's kind of, in some senses, you can't win that battle just on communication itself. So I really like your suggestion of kind of tackling it from the top down.
Yeah, I think there needs to be regulation, and I think the people in the public need to be well informed, and it's our duty to inform them well. And it's a mix, but what we don't want to have is scientists who are busy with their day jobs and working now and again to try to do public communication against people who have no qualification and are seeking to benefit materially from misinformation. That's really an imbalance, and so there probably does have to be some regulation around that.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I guess people must be afraid to speak up as well sometimes, right? Because we've all seen how out of hands some of these groups can get.
Definitely
Adds to the challenge. So on top of all your kind of public work, you've also achieved some incredible accomplishments in your career. And I want to highlight that in 2020, for the Queen's Birthday Honours, you were awarded an OBE, which is fantastic. It's incredible. I wondered, what advice would you give to young women looking to follow in your footsteps and to start a career in science?
Yeah, it was a lovely thing to have that honour, but of course it's for our whole team, and maybe these honours should reflect teams, because really, just to say that there are brilliant nurses, doctors, administrators at the Glasgow Research Facility, and the scientists at the CVR also, and many on very short-term contracts, really sort of worked incredibly hard during that period, and so that honour is for them, really. As well. And anyway, in terms of women wanting to do science, I think more women really should, and I think if you're interested in ideas and scientific ideas and new sort of creative ways of developing science, then it's really important that you give those ideas weight and think carefully about them, and think carefully about a career in science. And I think it's really incredibly rewarding. So in some ways it's the freest profession, because you can aim to answer your own questions, and I guess for a while you have to work within the constraints of what's required and where the funding is coming from and so on, but you can be quite creative with what you want to do, and that's fantastic. I think that it's really important also you do have to be a bit pragmatic and make sure that you pass the exams and so on if you need to do that. And I think also if you find certain things difficult or challenging, and women quite often say that they find things like public speaking challenging, then I would tackle that head on and work on it. And you don't have to be perfect, and if you're not, then surround yourself with people who can cover those areas that you are not so good at. I think you don't have to be good at everything. You can be really quite good at some things and very weak at others.
Yeah. What would your advice be then for improving public speaking? Like, how would you tackle that head on? Is it volunteering to give for more talking opportunities? Is it kind of external training courses if you can get access to them? What's helped you?
Yeah, I've done some training courses, which I find really helpful, maybe a little bit painful watching yourself back on video and things like that, but that I find very helpful. I think just putting yourself in the situation and not letting it, being aware perhaps of the issue, but not letting it stop you doing what you want to do. It is important. I think communication is really critical. And so if that's an issue, then developing that area is important. I remember John Weber, actually, who and Paul Kleinerman and various others, who Mike Jacobs, for example, at the Royal Free in London. These people were mentors that I really looked up to, and I watched how they interacted with other people, and I think they were very helpful also in giving feedback, and so I have gradually employed their advice to the best of my ability. And I like watching people that yeah, I mean, there are many excellent women. Sharon on the call is a really great example of that. There are many others, and I think perhaps one of the things to realize is that your style can be a bit different from others that you see around, and that you can also develop your own personal style.
Definitely, yeah, that's so helpful. Thank you. Yeah, for me, I've done an external training course and it changed everything. Because like you said, it's quite uncomfortable to see those videos, but actually it really gives you a perspective of what you do and helps you kind of form your own personal way of approaching things. And having those mentors, like you said, is also really good. I always make notes when I watch a talk to see, you know, the things I liked, you know, that I could try and include later on.
Yeah, definitely.
Do you think we're still facing barriers as women in STEM? Like, have you faced barriers as a woman in STEM?
I think we face fewer barriers as time goes on, and that's down to the hard work of people before us. But there are barriers. There are internal barriers and external barriers, and I think it's not just an issue of men and women. I think it's also an issue. There are issues of class and of education systems and all of that, which should, you know, I think it's worth being aware of those. I am someone that thinks that it's largely internal, and that if you can address those internal barriers, then the external ones are actually not as high. So I think that, yeah, I mean, there are some obviously, if you look at committees, still many of them are very dominated by men, and not just men, but men who've almost certainly had a private school education. And I think that that's fine, but it does indicate that other people are not feeling the same urge to progress, and perhaps you have to slightly go ahead, sort of slightly push yourself to accept positions that you might be asked to apply for example, but might be a bit reluctant to take. And so I think there are huge gender issues still, and also others which are a little bit less easy to, they're not as obvious, but they're still there.
Yeah, they're harder to identify, aren't they? And it's quite difficult to kind of do, for example, blind hiring in science, because you have your like publication list, which automatically gives away like quite a lot of information about yourself. So there's definitely difficulties there. And like you said, if you're kind of not being given those opportunities early on because you have come from a less advantaged background, then that can really stack the weights against you, and it's very hard for people to overcome that, you know. But I think, like you said, things are definitely progressing, and I'm looking forward to seeing what science is going to look like in another 50 years. I
think there are things that we could do to even things up, right?
Yeah, definitely.
I do think that particularly that kind of confident, assertive, public speaking communication is something to give to children early, and initiatives that could help them with that, and to widen their expectations are really useful initiatives. There are some in Glasgow which are really quite good. There's a nice one that works with the Govan area of Glasgow, and giving kids who are interested in science a voice, and able to ask questions which are often quite difficult to answer. And those interactions, now that we have the internet, you know, I think there are many opportunities that come there. And also, of course, there are children in other countries who have much less vision of what might be possible for them.
I guess this really ties in nicely with what you've been saying throughout this talk about communication. You know, it can be used as a tool to engage the public and also to do outreach within schools and with the policymakers. So it really is such an important thread to a scientific career, which you've really highlighted well. I think we're kind of coming towards a point now where we can open up to any questions. So if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. Let's have a little look. I've got a Q&A section here. So I've got a question here from Amy, and she says, as a working class academic from Stoke-on-Trent, it's great to hear your story, as I often feel isolated in academia. I have had many comments around my accent. Is this something that you've also had to deal with, and how did you deal with it?
I've definitely had comments about my accent because I worked in London for 10 years, and I think I deal with that with humour, but I also learned to speak a little bit more slowly because Scottish people speak very rapidly. And so I think, yes, I have had comments, usually humorous ones. I think that's okay, and I think it's actually good to celebrate differences, regional differences in self-expression. What I would hope, though, is that it doesn't make people think of you in a differently, and that's the kind of subtle difference that probably does come into our interactions every day. And I think that, you know, we should highlight and bring in training perhaps to to highlight that you know, sometimes the way in which you say something can really influence the outcome. There are all sorts of pieces of research on that, aren't there? I remember my when I worked in London, the house officers that I came to London as a registrar, and I had 2 house officers that used to phone me up and put a Scottish accent on when they called me for advice, but I liked it. It was nice. But yeah, it certainly I guess you need to embrace it. As I say, I think you can be what you might perceive as being different from other people, and that's fine.
Thank you, Emma. We have another question, which was, I imagine that you work very long hours and any time away is very precious. How do you manage the demands on your time? And that question is from Sarah.
Okay, I think I manage that badly, but I do try to make time for family things. Family is just so important, and for, you know, I have a very supportive partner who's very patient, and he's also quite hardworking, so that that sort of helps. But yeah, I think organizing time is really critical, and making sure that there is time for those people that you that are closest to you. And I think that what I have learned is that saying yes to everything is saying no sometimes to them, and so I say no a lot more now than I used to.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Someone else has put, they're really surprised to hear that your physics teacher rang up the exam board to check on your high grade. I was shocked when you said that as well, because I thought,
right.
hold on a second. How did you deal with that at the time? And have you been back to your school since and given that teacher some feedback?
I think that teacher will be long retired, but if she's watching, it wasn't. Yeah, I think actually it wasn't her fault, because I did get a really low prelim mark, and I hadn't actually considered that studying was worthwhile before, and then I thought I'd just give it a shot and see what happened, and actually read the textbooks, as I say, and so I think it was okay. I forgive her for it.
We also have a question here from Sharon, who says, when you mentioned that every interaction matters, that really chimed with her, and she was wondering, what's the most striking example of this in your life?
I think probably it is with the Ugandan team, because for me, I actually was interested in infectious diseases because I was interested in host virus interactions, and also in travel and other cultures and in this sort of scientifically in this arms race between viruses and hosts. And of course, Uganda is like, it's the center of life in many ways, and so the diversity there is extraordinarily rich, and yeah, the opportunity seemed very small at the time, but then grew into a huge one. And I'm kind of also glad that I pushed forward by saying that I'm only doing an interesting project if I'm going to sort of work on the sequencing. It has to be with something interesting, and then those interactions very gradually sort of emerged from there. And I have a very deep sort of appreciation of Ugandan culture and the biodiversity in that country. Yes, I think, and also the other thing is that I think that there is a ripple effect, and you might make a kind of offhand comment to someone who may never come back and speak to you about it again. Perhaps like that physics teacher.
Yeah,
right. I think you have to be quite careful with how what you say to people and how you project yourself all the time.
Well, thank you. I think we have time just for one more question. So apologies if I haven't got round to your question. I'm sure Emma will be happy if you ping her an email afterwards if we haven't got round to chatting with you today and covering your topic. So the last question is thinking about the importance of communication with policymakers and the public. Do you think the current messaging to the public is high enough on the news agenda?
I think that the messaging to the public is high on the news agenda at the moment, but perhaps at times when there's something else going on and we're not in the midst of a pandemic, it's not high enough. And I think that also means that it's not high enough on the agenda of politicians, because the media to a large extent seem to direct a lot of what they respond to. And that doesn't work for pandemic preparedness, for example, or for our health service. So, I think that those important areas need long-term investment. And so if the media were to focus a bit more on how important it is to develop the infrastructure for science and for our health service, that would be a good thing. And I also think that the messaging is sometimes a bit sort of unnuanced, and it would be good to see more about things that we perhaps more reflective pieces in some of the media about what we don't understand yet and what sort of approaches are being used to try to understand them better.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Emma. I've enjoyed chatting with you so much today. It's been a pleasure. I'm just going to hand over to Sharon to kind of close the session for today. So thank you.
Thanks very much.
Well, thank you to both for absolutely fascinating, yet again a fascinating session, listening to both Emma and Angie. I mean, Emma, what you said it's really kind of chimed in so many ways with me, actually. I really enjoyed your discussion about communicating in science, because when you're trained as a scientist, you're trained about molecules, you're trained about molecular biology. And the ability to communicate with so many different people, the public, your colleagues, policymakers, I think you've explored that really well today. And what is also very clear is that together you've communicated very clearly for us today as well. So, a great success, and thank you so much. So thank you for your contributions. Also, thank you to the audience for your questions. Apologies if we didn't get around to all of them, but I hope you've enjoyed the session. And please do look out for the next event that we'll be advertising on our website and through LinkedIn and other media in the future. So thanks again to Emma and Angie, and goodbye to all.